Can I help you, old-timer? Lost your way to the soup kitchen. The voice was a whip-crack of youthful arrogance, slicing through the sterile, oil-scented air of the gun shop. It belonged to Kyle, an instructor barely old enough to have known a world without the internet. Yet he wore his tactical vest like a second skin, a costume of authority. The man he addressed didn't flinch. He stood like a weathered oak, ancient and unmovable, his worn flannel jacket a stark contrast to the gleaming black rifles that lined the walls of Tactical Advantage. His face was a roadmap of hard years, his eyes a pale, distant blue that seemed to look through the polished surfaces and into a time long past. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and an aura of profound stillness. He ignored the insult, not out of weakness, but because it was irrelevant, a gnat buzzing at the ear of a lion. His gaze was fixed on a particular rifle mounted in a place of honor, a Daniel Defense 18 Malawian Quatches, short-barreled and configured for close-quarters battle. His hand, gnarled and scarred, lifted slightly, fingers tracing its shape in the air. The gas block, the old man finally said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. Is it pinned? Kyle blinked, the pre-packaged condescension faltering for a beat. It was a technical question, specific and knowledgeable, not the rambling of a vagrant. He recovered quickly, his smirk returning. Yeah, it's pinned. Mil-spec. Not that it would mean anything to you, but the old man wasn't listening. His eyes were distant, the scent of Hoppa's number 9 in the air triggering a cascade of phantom sensations. The thick, humid smell of jungle rot, the coppery tang of blood, the deafening roar of a Stoner 63 firing on full auto. He could almost feel the weight of his own long-lost rifle, its stock slick with mud and sweat. The brief exchange had drawn the attention of the shop's co-owner, Chad, a man whose physique was built by a personal trainer but whose spirit had never been tested by anything more strenuous than a quarterly sales report. He strode over, his expensive boots clicking on the polished concrete floor. He sized up the old man with a practiced, dismissive glance that categorized him as a non-customer, a liability, a piece of human debris that had drifted into his immaculate emporium of tactical chic. Everything all right here, Kyle? Chad asked, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. He didn't look at the old man, addressing his employee as if the subject of their conversation were an inanimate object. Just helping this gentleman understand he's in the wrong place, Kyle sneered. Chad finally turned his gaze on the veteran, a look of profound distaste twisting his lips. Listen, Pops, this is a high-end establishment. We sell tools for professionals, for law enforcement, and serious enthusiasts. This isn't a museum. The old man's focus remained on the rifle. His stoicism was a wall Chad's insults couldn't breach, and this silent defiance infuriated him. It was a rejection of his perceived status, of the little kingdom he had built. I carried one like it, the old man said, his voice quiet but carrying a strange weight. Different platform. Heavier. But the balance is the same, Chad laughed, a short, ugly bark. Carried one where? In your dreams? Look, I don't have time for this. You're making my customers uncomfortable. You need to leave. The old man finally turned his pale blue eyes from the rifle and met Chad's gaze. There was no anger in them, no fear. There was only a vast, weary patience, the look of a man who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires in the space of a single firefight and found this little display of dominance utterly insignificant. Across the store, arranging a display of holographic sights, was Marcus. He was 32, with a prosthetic leg hidden beneath his jeans and the tightly coiled energy of a man who had spent 3 tours in the Hindu Kush. He had heard the initial exchange, and his veteran's intuition, a finely honed sense for trouble, had flared to life. He watched the scene unfold, not as a casual observer, but as an analyst. He saw what Chad and Kyle, blinded by their own self-importance, could not. He saw the old man's stance, feet shoulder-width apart, weight perfectly centered, a posture of relaxed readiness that couldn't be taught in a civilian self-defense class. It was ingrained, burned into muscle memory by thousands of hours of training and combat. Then, as the old man turned slightly, Marcus saw it. On the weathered skin of his inner wrist, nearly lost in a sea of wrinkles and sunspots, was the faint, blue-black outline of a trident. It was an old-school tattoo, crude and faded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Marcus felt a jolt, a current of disbelief and awe. He looked closer, his eyes scanning the man's shabby attire. And there, pinned to the frayed lapel of his flannel jacket, was a tiny, tarnished piece of metal. It was no bigger than a thumbnail, a simple, dark pin that could easily be mistaken for a random trinket. But Marcus had spent countless hours in military archives and museums. He knew what it was. It was a MACVSOG presentation piece, a clandestine award from the Vietnam era, given for valorous actions that could never be officially acknowledged. It was a ghost's medal. His breath caught in his throat. He was looking at a living legend, a piece of history, and these two arrogant children were treating him like garbage. I said, "You need to leave," Chad repeated, his voice rising. He was used to being obeyed. His father owned the store, the city, and, in his mind, the very air people breathed within his domain. The old man's silent refusal was an intolerable affront. Now the old man didn't move. He simply held Chad's gaze and said, with a quiet finality that brooked no argument, "I just wanted to feel the balance." This was the final straw. For Chad, this wasn't about a homeless man anymore. It was about power. It was about enforcing the hierarchy of his world. He reached out and grabbed the old man's thin arm, his fingers digging into the worn fabric of the jacket. "That's it. We're done." He started to pull the man toward the door, expecting the frail body to yield, to stumble, to comply. He was wrong. The moment Chad's hand closed around his arm, the world seemed to slow down for the old man. The pressure on his bicep was a trigger, a familiar stimulus that unlocked a lifetime of conditioned responses. He didn't feel Chad's grip. He felt the desperate grab of a drowning comrade in a flooded tunnel, the restraining hand of an MP in a Saigon bar, the enemy's lunge in the suffocating darkness of a jungle night. There was no conscious thought, only action. He didn't strike. He didn't resist. He simply moved. With an almost imperceptible shift of his hips and a rotation of his shoulder, he flowed with Chad's pull, redirecting the force. His body became a fulcrum, and Chad's own momentum became the lever. Chad found himself suddenly off balance, his grip broken not by strength, but by a geometry of movement he couldn't comprehend. The old man hadn't even raised his hands. He had simply created a void where his arm had been, and Chad had stumbled into it. The entire event took less than a second. It was fluid, economical, and terrifyingly efficient. The old man now stood in the center of a small, invisible circle of respect, a space he had claimed without a single aggressive act. Chad staggered back, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Kyle, who had been moving to assist, froze mid-step, his bravado evaporating. They had expected a feeble old man. They had encountered something ancient and dangerous. They had prodded a sleeping dragon, and, for a terrifying moment, it had opened one eye. The quiet dignity of the man had been replaced by a glimpse of lethal capability, a promise of violence held in perfect check. He hadn't fought back. He had simply demonstrated that a fight would be a foolish and painful proposition. The air in the shop grew thick and heavy. The other customers, who had been trying to ignore the confrontation, were now staring, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. The power dynamic had been inverted in a single, silent motion. Chad's face flushed with a mixture of fear and humiliation. His authority had been publicly dismantled, not with a shout, but with a whisper of movement. Marcus, watching from the aisle, felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. His suspicions were confirmed. This was no ordinary veteran. This was a man who had walked in the darkest places on Earth and survived. This was an injustice that could not be allowed to stand. He knew what he had to do. The risk of being wrong was nothing compared to the shame of doing nothing. With practiced stealth, Marcus moved to the back of the store, keeping his eyes on the unfolding drama. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He had a number, a contact from his time in the service, a man who worked in a quiet office in the Pentagon, a master sergeant who collected favors and pulled strings for his brothers in arms. Marcus took a quick, surreptitious photo of the old man, zooming in on the tarnished pin on his lapel. He attached the image to a text message, his thumb hovering over the keypad as he composed the words carefully. He couldn't afford to be dismissed as a crank. The message had to be precise, a key to unlock a very specific door. He typed, "Urgent. Tactical Advantage Gun Shop, Arlington. Possible SOG Original, Trident Tattoo, wearing an unofficial presentation pin. Being ejected by staff. Request identity verification. Code Echo Delta. This is Ranger Marcus Thorne, callsign Badger. 6-inch. The code was an old, unofficial protocol, a way for veterans in the field to signal a dire situation involving one of their own, bypassing the usual chain of command. Using it was a gamble. If he was wrong, he'd face serious consequences for crying wolf. But as he looked at the old man, now standing with a profound and lonely dignity in the face of renewed hostility, he knew it was a risk he had to take. He pressed send. The message vanished into the ether, a digital prayer sent up in the hope that someone, somewhere, was still listening, that the bonds forged in fire had not been severed by time and indifference. Chad, recovering his nerve, let his humiliation curdle into rage. The flicker of fear was gone, replaced by a burning need to reassert his dominance. He wouldn't be intimidated. He wouldn't be made a fool of in his own store. Security, he roared, his voice cracking slightly. Get this bum out of here. He assaulted me. 2 large men in black polo shirts with security emblazoned on the back materialized from a back office. They were large, soft men, their bulk born of inactivity, not discipline. They saw a frail-looking old man and 2 agitated young bosses. They made the obvious calculation. They moved toward the veteran, their expressions a mixture of boredom and professional sternness. This time, the old man offered no resistance. The glimpse of the warrior was gone, replaced once more by the stoic patience of the elder. He had made his point. There was nothing left to prove to these people. He let them take his arms, their grips clumsy and unnecessarily rough. He walked with them, his steps slow and steady, his back straight. As they pushed him through the glass doors and out onto the hot pavement of the parking lot, he turned his head and looked back one last time. His eyes met Chad's. There was no malice in his gaze, only a deep, abiding sorrow. It was the look of a teacher disappointed in a prize pupil, of a father watching his son make a terrible mistake. Then the doors hissed shut, and he was gone from their sight. Chad stood panting, chest puffed out, feeling a hollow victory. He had expelled the threat, restored order. He was the king of his castle once more. Outside, Marcus watched from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the old man stumble slightly as he was shoved, catching himself on a concrete planter. He sat down heavily on the edge, a solitary, forgotten figure in the glaring afternoon sun. Then, the world changed. It began not with a sound, but with a presence. 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans, their windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, glided into the parking lot with the silent, predatory grace of sharks. They took up positions flanking the entrance to the gun shop, effectively blockading it. They were followed by a city police cruiser, which pulled up at a respectful distance, its light bar flashing in a silent, rhythmic pulse. The doors of the Suburbans opened in unison, and 4 men emerged. They were not soldiers or police officers. They were something else entirely, men in impeccably tailored dark suits with earpieces discreetly coiled behind their ears. They moved with a chilling economy of motion, securing the area, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing every person in the vicinity as a potential threat. Their presence instantly transformed the mundane parking lot into a high-stakes security zone. A hush fell over the onlookers. From the rear door of the lead Suburban, a figure emerged. He was a tall, lean man in the brilliant white dress uniform of the United States Navy. The sun glinted off the golden stripes on his sleeves and the array of medals on his chest, but it was the 2 silver stars on each of his shoulder boards that commanded absolute attention. This was a Rear Admiral. He moved with an unhurried, implacable purpose, his face a granite mask of controlled fury. He completely ignored the gun shop and the gawking faces pressed against its windows. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the area until they found their target. The old man, still sitting quietly on the planter, watching the proceedings with a detached curiosity. The Admiral strode directly toward him, his polished shoes clicking a resolute rhythm on the asphalt. The Admiral came to a stop 3 feet in front of the old man. The 4 suited agents formed a discreet semicircle behind him, facing outward. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. Chad and Kyle, their faces now pale with confusion and a dawning sense of dread, watched from behind the glass door of their shop. The Admiral did not speak. He simply stood, his posture ramrod straight, and looked down at the man in the worn flannel jacket. Then, in a single, flawless motion, he brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most profound salute Chad or Kyle had ever witnessed. It was not a gesture of mere protocol. It was an act of pure, unadulterated reverence. It was the salute of a warrior to his chieftain. He held it, his arm rigid, his gaze locked on the old man. "Master Chief," the Admiral's voice finally boomed, clear and resonant, cutting through the silence. "I apologize for the delay. We came as soon as we heard." The old man looked up, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, accepting the gesture. The Admiral lowered his hand and then turned, his body swiveling with military precision to face the gun shop. His eyes were chips of ice. His voice dropped, but it lost none of its carrying power. It was a voice accustomed to commanding fleets, and it now dissected the two young men through inches of reinforced glass. He began to speak, and his words were a citation, a history lesson, and a verdict all in one. "You stand in the presence of Master Chief Petty Officer Silas Kane," he declared, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "A founding member of SEAL Team 2, Frogman, UDT Class 29. A man who served this nation in the shadows for 30 years so that spoiled children like you could play soldier in your air-conditioned shops." The Admiral took a step closer to the glass, his gaze pinning Chad and Kyle like insects to a board. "This man wears the Navy Cross, awarded for actions in the Mekong Delta in 1968, where he single-handedly held off a battalion of Viet Cong, saving his entire platoon. He holds the Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Bronze Star with Valor Device, 4 Purple Hearts for wounds taken in combat." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The faces of Chad and Kyle had drained of all color, replaced by a ghastly, waxy pallor. Their mouths hung open in disbelief. "The pin you couldn't be bothered to respect," the Admiral continued, his voice dripping with contempt, "was given to him by General Westmoreland himself, in country, for a mission that is still classified. A mission that changed the course of that war. This man is not a bum, he is a national treasure. He is a part of the bedrock upon which this entire nation stands. And you put your hands on him." The Admiral pointed a single, trembling finger at Chad. "You have dishonored yourselves, this establishment, and the very freedoms men like him bled to secure." He then turned to one of his agents. "Shut this place down. Contact the ATF. I want their federal firearms license suspended pending a full investigation into their business practices and their flagrant disrespect for a veteran of senior status. Get their fathers on the phone. I am quite sure they will be interested to learn how their sons conduct business." The agent nodded curtly and spoke into his wrist. Inside the shop, the world Chad and Kyle had built was collapsing around them. The foundation of their arrogance had been pulverized by the weight of a history they had been too ignorant to recognize. They were no longer owners or instructors. They were just two small, terrified boys who had made a catastrophic mistake. The Admiral turned back to Silas, his expression softening instantly from righteous anger to deep concern. He offered his hand. "Master Chief, let's get you out of here." Silas looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it, allowing the younger, stronger man to help him to his feet. His old joints creaked in protest. He stood, his small frame seeming to possess an immense gravity. He looked over at the glass door of the shop, at the two young men, now being spoken to by a stern-faced agent. Their faces were a canvas of shame and terror. The Admiral began to guide Silas toward the waiting Suburban, but the old man stopped. He held up a hand, a silent request for a moment more. He walked slowly, deliberately, back toward the entrance of the shop. The agent questioning Chad and Kyle stepped aside, sensing the shift. Silas stopped just before the glass, his pale eyes finding Chad's. There was no triumph in his expression. No, I told you so. There was only that same profound, weary sadness from before. "The weight," Silas said, his raspy voice barely a whisper, yet it carried with the force of a judgment. "You sell these fine rifles. You talk about mil-spec and muzzle velocity. But you forget the most important part." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The weight. not the pounds and ounces. The weight of the responsibility that comes with it. Every time you lift one, you lift that weight. Don't ever forget that, son. It was not a condemnation. It was a lesson. It was an act of grace from a man who had every right to be vengeful. With that, he turned away. He had said all that needed to be said. He walked back to the Admiral, who placed a steadying hand on his back. Together, the living legend and the Admiral who revered him walked to the waiting vehicle. The door opened, Silas ducked inside, and a moment later, the black Suburban pulled away as silently as it had arrived, leaving behind a shattered afternoon and two young men to begin the long, painful process of reckoning with the ghost of a hero they had tried and failed to throw away. Marcus watched them go, a single tear of vindication cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Honor, he thought, had been served.